Madam President.
Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you very much. We have a humanitarian and national security crisis at our southern border. Just last month, Customs and Border Protection encountered 241,000 contacts of people coming across that southern border. That is 3 times the amount that we had in October of 2020. Since Joe Biden's been president, there have been 6.6 million border contacts and 1.8 million gotaways. And the gotaways, those are the folks that Customs and Border Protection, CBP, saw but couldn't encounter, couldn't get to. That is more than President Obama and President Trump's administration combined. Children are being trafficked. People are dying. And the cartels are profiting. And my colleague from Iowa just referenced the southern border. Total, we've seen 172 people on the terrorist watch list try to enter our country in the last year. 169 at the southern border. And to put that in perspective, that number used to be in the single digits every year. Last month, it was 12. We're encountering more people on the FBI's terrorist watch list in 1 month than we used to get in an entire year. Border security is national security. Certainly the events in Israel should bring home to us the danger of a border that is not properly protected. And it is President Biden's policies that have led to this humanitarian and security crisis. Now, I've been down to the southern border 4 times, just recently as well. And I've talked to the folks at the CBP, and yes, they need some resources. Things like the Aerostat blimps have been hugely successful in being able to counter the cartel's drones and to monitor people trying to come across the border. So there are resources that we can provide to our southern border to help strengthen it. But you know what the number one thing they told me they needed? Was a change in policy. Because it's the policy that is driving all these people to take this dangerous journey to illegally cross into our country. Well, now the Senate is going to take up border security. And President Biden's solution is to ask for more money to help process all the people coming across the border. That's not going to fly. If you are just processing them more efficiently coming across the border, you're not deterring anybody from coming across our border. It's the policies that are sending the message to people to come here illegally. The policy needs to change. So as we consider a bill, perhaps a supplemental bill where we're going to have border security in it, it must contain policy changes. The policy is what's caused this. We have to change the policy. Well, what are some of those policies? We see that we have an asylum system and a parole system that's broken. We need to address that. And then we must have a first safe country policy. You may say, what's a first safe country? Well, if you're seeking asylum, you're fleeing your home country, what this policy says is you stop in the first safe country and you apply for asylum in the United States from there, not within our own country. And I know that there are people who don't like this idea, but let me tell you, Canada has this policy. So, for example, if you're traveling from Mexico through the United States to get to Canada, and you want to seek asylum in Canada, you have to remain in the United States. That's their policy. That's the Canadians' policy. Oh, you know who else has that policy? The United Kingdom. In fact, I've got a chart right here with all the countries that have that policy. Italy, France, Spain, Germany, Ireland. In fact, not only does our northern neighbor have this policy, but 29 other countries have this policy that you have to remain in the first safe country. What does that mean? That if you're coming to our southern border, you must remain in Mexico. And that is part of the policy changes that we need to have. We must bring back remain in Mexico. President Biden has direct responsibility for the humanitarian crisis at our southern border. Children are being trafficked. People are dying, and the cartels are profiting off of all of this. He is responsible. If he's not going to act, we in the Senate must act. My Republican colleagues and I have put forward common sense solutions on how to address the issues at our southern border. We must have these policy changes if we are going to pass any sort of supplemental that is going to include additional funding for anything else. The number one issue we have here is addressing this humanitarian and national security crisis. That is the priority for the American people. It is a priority for my Republican colleagues, and my Senate Democrat colleagues must make that their priority as well. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Kansas.
Thank you, Madam President. Today I'd like to discuss one of the many critical topics we face in the country, in the Congress, in the Senate, federal spending. And we are certainly focused upon the issues that we're trying to bring together in regard to an emergency supplemental, in regard to supporting Ukraine, Israel, combat China in the South Pacific and around the globe, Iran, terrorist activities, and as the gentleman from my neighboring state of Nebraska indicated, issues involving our national security at our own borders. Today, I want to take just a step back and indicate that we were on a path, and I wish we would get back on a path of making certain that the appropriation bills that the Senate Committee on Appropriations has considered, amended, and approved and brought to the Senate floor. 12 appropriation bills annually. The Senate has considered, the full committee has considered all and passed all 12, but the Senate, this body, which is again using its week to consider nominations, still has all but 3 of those bills yet to consider. It is important that federal spending is provided to keep our government open and functioning and open for the American people. This topic has dominated a lot of conversations nationally now for months. We are operating under a continuing resolution that funds the federal government at its current level until late January, mid-January, or early February, and that when that current continuing resolution then expires. I certainly support the efforts of Senator Collins and Senator Murray, the vice chairman and the chairman of the committee on appropriations. I support their work. It's my hope that Leader Schumer will allow those appropriation bills, that process, to continue. 3 out of 12 is insufficient, and the consequences of our failure to address the remaining bills is consequential. When considering appropriation bills, it's critical that, in my view, 2 core principles are established. First is that we must get our federal spending under control. We borrow way too much money, and the consequence will come to haunt us economically, and our ability to respond to national security issues is diminished when our spending is out of line with our revenues. Second, it's our duty to draft appropriation bills that are judicious, responsible, carefully tailored, and that we establish priorities, determine what the nation's highest priorities are for the coming or current fiscal year. Congress must start this work immediately, not wait for the final moments, not wait till middle of January or the beginning of February. Otherwise, we are on a path, once again, to another continuing resolution, or as we said we would not do again, a significant and huge omnibus in which these bills are all packaged together, reducing the transparency, reducing the understanding of not only members of the American public, but reducing the capability of United States senators to fully understand the nature of the bill, and not giving the opportunity for my colleagues who don't serve on the Appropriations Committee the chance to amend and alter the bills that our committee has approved. A CR puts spending on autopilot. It is the antithesis, it's the opposite of what these principles involve. The idea that the federal government should be funded next year at the same level as last year is wrong. And it's wrong that the same amount of funding ought to go to each program. Some things maybe ought to be eliminated. There are some things I know that should be eliminated. There are things that maybe are receiving the right amount of money, and there may be things that are deserving, as the priorities change, of additional spending. The best hope to avoid another CR and to avoid a much criticized omnibus spending bill at the end is to continue the process that we've started on FY, the fiscal year 24's appropriation bills, to consider them on the Senate floor and to move them forward. Over the past 9 months, the senator from New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen, and I have worked to craft the appropriations bill for the subcommittee that we lead, called Commerce, Justice, Science, and to balance those two core principles, fiscal responsibility with thoughtful allocation of scarce resources. The CJS bill, one of 12, one of those bills that has yet to be considered on the Senate floor, the Commerce, Justice, Science bill provides funding for a host of federal agencies that play a critical role in the lives of every single American, certainly every single Kansan. The Drug Enforcement Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the NASA, the National Weather Service, the National Science Foundation, and just a host of other activities which enjoy broad bipartisan support both here in Congress and among the American people. With respect to fiscal responsibility, this bill, Commerce, Justice, Science for fiscal year 24, cuts budget authority, actual federal spending, by $1.3 billion compared to the amount of money that was enacted in the previous fiscal year, FY23. That's about an amount equal to 1.5% below the current level of spending. So we are cutting spending in our appropriation process. American families face painful cuts and challenges in their own budgets, and I think they can expect, or should expect is the way I guess I would say it, should expect government to prove it can make the same kind of difficult decisions. The FY24 CJS bill, crafted by Senator Shaheen and I, delivers on that obligation, and I thank my colleagues on the our Appropriations Subcommittee, both Republicans and Democrats, for working together to accomplish that goal. And in Congress, every once in a while, we have a vote on the penny plan. It seems seemingly impossible to achieve the notion that we should at least be able to cut federal spending by 1%, 1 penny out of the dollar. Senator Shaheen and I have found a way to make that penny and a half, a little more than 1%, 1.5%, that savings of more than $1.3 billion. That second core principle that I approach the appropriations process is that Congress must make careful and deliberate decisions about how we allocate resources. Our opportunity to do that comes from certainly the assistance of our experts in our budget arena, but a significant number of hearings in front of the committee in which people have the opportunity to come highlight, each agency, each department, their budget priorities, and give us a chance to ask questions and to pursue what the right balance is. and we owe that obligation making the right decisions to the American taxpayer. There are also areas that are vitally important that we, from time to time, include increases, where appropriate, to address new threats, new challenges, and new areas that are critical to the United States in us maintaining our competitive edge and our national security. For example, in the FY24 CJS bill, we provide resources to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, home to some of the world's best scientists, to ensure that we to ensure that we understand both the promise and the pitfalls of artificial intelligence. NASA stands on the verge of returning the first humans. Perhaps in this case, it sounds like the first woman to the moon in over 50 years. It was vitally important that we provide NASA with resources necessary to execute the Artemis mission. There may be those who would say that that's not a priority, but the Chinese would like nothing more than to beat us back to the moon and to become the world's preeminent space power, and we will not, should not allow that to be the case. The National Weather Service needs to recapitalize its weather satellites. These satellites are vital to people in Kansas as we predict the weather and determine the safety and the economic well-being of our state. They're vital to determining new severe weather patterns, and they will save lives. These examples are just a few of why it's important we have an annual appropriation process to make the changes to address things that Americans care about and to deal with the things that have changed in our lives across the country. America's needs and priorities, they're not static, they're not the same, nor should government's decisions on how to spend taxpayer dollars be either. This bill, the FY24 CGS bill, even in the context of its savings, still manages to make responsible investments to address the newest and most important challenges facing our country. I want to spend a moment longer on discussing the funding and oversight of the Department of Justice. Crime across the country is increasing. It is a problem for almost every American and certainly every American family, and it is deserving of being prioritized by the United States Senate, the Congress, and the administration. Like many Americans, I have serious concerns with many of the policies coming from the Biden Department of Justice. Many new regulations issued by ATF threaten to trample core constitutional rights and are often a solution in search of a problem. DOJ's investigative priorities are often designed to satisfy the loudest activists rather than the everyday American and their real concern, including skyrocketing violent crime across the country and in the state of Kansas. Crime is affecting even our safest communities, and Kansans and Americans are concerned about what Washington is doing to keep their families safe. Fentanyl is also a crisis, has been and continues to be and grows, a growing crisis in our country. This is not just an assertion. Again, the numbers speak for themselves. After a year in which more than 100,000 Americans lost their lives to fentanyl, and with the highest increase in deaths among infants over 1 year old, President Biden's budget for DOJ proposes hiring only 4 new DEA special agents, the Drug Enforcement Agency's agents. And yet, the president's budget request, it indicates that DOJ needs more than 1,200 new attorneys, primarily at the division that files civil lawsuits. DOJ's priorities have been and are misguided. When I became the top Republican, the vice chairman on the CGS subcommittee, I made it a when I became the chairman of the committee, I made it a priority to meet with countless DEA, FBI, and ATF special agents, deputy U.S. Marshals, Board of Prison Correctional Officers, intelligence analysts, and prosecutors in the field. I'm immensely impressed by their professionalism, their courage, and their dedication to keeping the American people safe. Indiscriminate, thoughtless budget cuts will result in fewer deputy marshals to apprehend violent fugitives, fewer FBI agents to investigate terrorists and intelligent threats from China, fewer DEA agents to combat the Mexican cartels, and fewer federal prosecutors, not just to arrest violent criminals, but to send them to prison. Instead of defunding federal law enforcement, we should use the appropriations process to prioritize, to make deliberate and judicious decisions about the Department of Justice's priorities. This means providing funding for the core activities critical to public safety while rejecting these proposals that make less sense or no sense from the Biden administration. To that end, the CGAS bill cuts funding for the Department of Justice by $817 million, a more than 2% cut. Within that amount, funding for the FBI's construction account is cut by $591 million. This is exactly the type of careful cuts we were able to achieve while maintaining the jobs of thousands of agents and intelligence analysts and others who help us combat violent crimes, child predators, Mexican cartels, and foreign intelligence agents. Additionally, working with my Republican colleagues in the committee, we were able to address some of the worst errors and abuses by DOJ in recent years. During the committee markup, I secured new legislative language to prohibit funding for the investigation of parents who peacefully protest school board meetings, a DOJ initiative epitomized by the outrageous school board memo. Senator Rubio, my colleague from Florida, secured new legislative language prohibiting the department from targeting Americans for their religious beliefs. To my colleagues who have deep reservations about the policies of the Department of Justice, know that I share those concerns. And yet I believe we have prepared a responsible bill that makes meaningful investments in the Department of Justice and its law enforcement mission. The CJS appropriation bill is a credible demonstration of fiscal responsibility while making judicious and careful investments in programs and services that Americans strongly support. Madam Chairwoman, I yield the floor.
Senator from West Virginia.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to once again speak about a subject that President Biden and his administration are refusing to address, and that is this crisis on our southern border. I've been extremely outspoken about this topic, and many of us have, especially when it comes to the need for deterrence along our southern border, the alarming drug epidemic that continues to harm my state and the rest of the entire country, and the desperate need to make changes to our immigration policy and the laws that define our homeland security. The American people see the numbers, but it's not just numbers. They see the actual human effects within their own cities and states of this rampant illegal immigration. It can no longer be ignored. In just the past year, there have been more than 2.4 million illegal encounters on our southern border. We've all seen them on our television sets. And that is more than a 180% increase since fiscal year 2019. 169 encounters with individuals on our country's terror watch list, 6 times the amount of the past year. And fentanyl seizures along the U.S.-Mexico border have hit record highs. I see my fellow senator from Kansas. He spent a lot of time on this fentanyl issue because it's so devastating to our states. More than 26,000 pounds of illicit fentanyl were seized along the country's southern border this past year. And this is just the data we know. It's hard to fathom that there were 600,000 gotaways. Those are people that were not even disrupted in their journey. The drugs and the threats to our national security that are streaming across our border that we might have missed. This is truly and simply an unmitigated crisis. There is no doubt that this is leading to, and sometimes already has created, an unsustainable situation across this country. But don't just take my word for it. I will offer some quotes. Quote, "The federal government's lack of intervention and coordination at the border has created an untenable situation." Quote, "This issue will destroy New York City." Quote, quote, "A federal crisis of inaction that is many years in the making." End of quote. These quotes are all direct quotes from Democrat governors and mayors across the country. Across the aisle and across the country, we know that President Biden's rhetoric and lack of action on the southern border has created an historic problem. In fact, this is a 50-state problem. I hear about this topic from West Virginians frequently. Constituents have expressed border security concerns to me, things like the catastrophic, flawed, and failed Biden-Harris approach to immigration and the loss of control of our southern border, the vulnerable state that our communities are left in by the flow of human trafficking and illicit drugs currently coming across our border, and the need to bolster our national security and the increase in crossings from the terror watch list. My home state of West Virginia is not a border state, so to speak, but we're all border states now. We are no stranger to the strife and grief created by the flow of harmful narcotics into our communities. From June 2022 to June 2023, West Virginia's provisional state data shows an estimated 1,415 West Virginians died from drug overdoses. These are husbands, brothers, sisters, moms and dads. It's indescribably sad. Drug overdoses caused over 5,200 emergency room visits, and our EMS teams responded to over 6,300 calls of a suspected drug overdose. These numbers are staggering, especially for a state as small as mine. So fentanyl overdoses in this country has become the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. Something has to be done, and it has to be done now and fast. This crisis on our southern border raises grave questions about the national security of our own country. In addition to the 279 individuals on the terror watch list that have been encountered at the southern border since President Biden took office, U.S. Customs and Border Protection has arrested over 35,000 migrants with criminal convictions in just this past year. Nearly half of the migrants encountered on our southern border are coming from countries other than Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador, with more than 24,000 Chinese citizens apprehended crossing into the United States from Mexico in the past year. Who are these people? We don't know. And yet, many of them are living in all of our states. My point is, the immigration crisis on our southern border is now more multifaceted than ever, and the open border virtual signaling from this administration has allowed that to happen. We truly have no idea who is entering our country illegally. So in a time of heightened national security risk, this is a chance that we cannot be willing to take. There is currently a large-scale ground war in Europe. Our ally and friend Israel is facing historic and unprecedented attacks of terror. And terrorists in the Indo-Pacific remain on tensions in the Indo-Pacific remain on high alert. So, as Leader McConnell stated on this same floor yesterday, quote, national security begins with border security, end quote. We can and should take needed action to mitigate the threats that we face. This starts by securing our southern border and making the policy changes necessary to defend our homeland from nefarious forces abroad. I keep saying policy changes because there are some who think if we just keep putting money into the situation, it's going to help the problem. All the money does is turn the asylum cases around faster, makes more people have a parole into the United States, and there again, a cycle of unknown people throughout the United States. Time and again, Republicans have asked the tough questions and put forward the solutions necessary to stop the crisis that we have seen unfold. Nearly every elected official, Democrat and Republican, both in the executive branch and in Congress, has acknowledged that there are top-to-bottom changes that needed to be done to our asylum system. That's what's being offered, and that is what needs to be delivered. Changes to our asylum system, meaningful changes to our parole system, and safe third country agreements. This will have meaningful effect on the problems that I've described. So now's the time to come to the table. Republicans stand for solutions that enforce and enhance not just the immigration laws that we have on the books, but the policy changes that we're advocating for. We back our hardworking CBP agents and guards on the ground who are overwhelmed and undersupported. And we need to finish the border wall and provide the necessary level of deterrence that we desperately need. I've been encouraged by my colleagues' bipartisan efforts for their ongoing talks to deliver the immigration policy changes that are increasingly needed. But any agreement will need to find consensus by the entire body. I implore my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to recognize the importance of the effort and of this moment. We simply do not have time to waste. We need to come together, secure our southern border, and fulfill the other national security obligations that are demanded of a nation as powerful as ours. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Kansas.
Madam President. Border, border, border. I just had lunch with Speaker Mike Johnson, a great friend, a classmate. We came in together, and that's what he said. He said he wished we could get us all a T-shirt that said border, border, border. In my office this week, no matter what the question is, the answer is secure the border. In fact, I think Speaker Johnson's been talking to some of the same people I've been talking to. I had the great time of my life this past 7-10 days back home in Kansas. I got to spend time with my grandchildren, teaching them how to hunt and fish and sled in a very welcome 10-inch snow. I got to see a lot of friends and family members and share what's going on in their lives and get caught up. But no matter where I went, the number one worry people have is about the concern of the safety and security of their own family. In Kansas, the heartland, the middle of the country, the middle state, people are concerned about their own safety and security, and why wouldn't they be? Since Joe Biden was sworn into office, over 10 million immigrants have come into our border, and over 1.5 million gotaways have occurred. 10 million people crossing our border illegally, 1.5 million gotaways. This crisis at our nation's border is the number one most immediate threat to our safety and security. This is a true, clear, and present danger to our nation. Just think about these numbers. Fentanyl is now the number one killer of young adults in America. It kills a Kansan every day. Nearly 300 young Americans are dying every day from fentanyl poisoning. Not to mention what's going on with human trafficking, the growth of the cartel, and the violence, as my dad, the police officers, taught me, as the violence always follows the drug trafficking. But it seems like these numbers are falling on deaf ears at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Just look at September, October, November. These look like they're all going to be record-setting months for the number of people crossing our border illegally in these months. But yet, for some unknown reason, the White House wants to take border security off the table in the supplemental bill. Why? That's what people are asking me back home. Why? That's the question Americans want to know. They point out the facts that we know well up here. Under this administration, we've seen 279 known terrorists try to cross our borders, more than 24,000 Chinese nationals, not to mention some 80,000 aliens of interest from countries like Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and Syria who have breached our borders. This is indeed an invasion of our border, and every American is now paying for it. As a matter of fact, it's now costing Americans nearly $500 billion a year. Let me say that again, $500 billion a year to house and take care of these illegal immigrants. Can you imagine how many Border Patrol officers, how much technology, how many drug dogs, and yes, how much fence could we build for $500 billion a year? Again, that's what Americans are asking me back home. It's time for this chamber to step up to the plate and do what is right for the American people. For such a time as this, we need leadership. And I'm grateful, I'm proud, and the American people are glad to hear the leadership on this side of the aisle are saying we will deny cloture on this supplemental bill if there's not meaningful border security. This concept of a supplemental bill without taking care of our national security, of sending over $100 billion to foreign lands without addressing our own national sovereignty, well, it actually reminds me of what Abraham Lincoln once said. You can fool all the people some of the time, and some of the people all the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. Let my message today be clear. Let's bring on the hard work, late nights, weekends. That's what Kansans do. We work hard. We have those values of a hard work ethic. And I'm certainly willing to do just that, to work hard to get to border security. Look, on this side of the aisle, we're not going to waver. We're not going to quit. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to secure our border and to get this right for once. And I urge every Republican to vote down cloture of this outrageous supplemental package unless we see true, meaningful border security included. Now, we've got solutions that this body can send to the President's desk today that wouldn't cost a dime. Changing the asylum policy alone could result in as many as 75% less people entering our nation illegally. 75%. If we just turn off the siren of asylum, we can cut back on those crossing our border some 75%. That would free up the Border Patrol officers to do their job that they were hired to do, catching the bad guys, stopping the fentanyl, stopping the human trafficking, rather than playing nursemaid to nearly 10,000 illegal people every day. And also from a policy standpoint, we have to limit the President's abuse of his parole powers, which has enabled over 1.5 million immigrant parolees to enter our nation under his watch. Our insistence that these measures be included in a supplemental bill are not partisan. They're not hard right distractions, as has been alleged, but it's an attempt to protect the lives and well-being of the Americans that elected us and our families, and to assure the sovereignty of this great nation. This is a national security issue, not an immigration issue. It's imperative, it's a must that any supplemental bill includes provisions to address these border issues. Any package agreed upon by all or some of the Senate Republican conference must actually be effective at controlling our borders. A measure that is advertised as stopping the torrent of illegal migration but is not in practice would be a devastating blow to the credibility of Republican senators on this issue over the long term and unacceptable to the people we represent. This is why I urge every Republican in this body to vote no on cloture on any bill that does not, at a minimum, include policy changes that meaningfully address the flood of illegal immigration at our southern border. Thank you, Madam President. I yield back.
Madam President.
The senator from Texas.
Madam President, I appreciate the comments of my colleague from Kansas. Coming from Texas, this is a familiar topic because we have a 1,200-mile common border with Mexico, and illegal immigration, drug smuggling, and everything that goes along with it has been something we've had to live with pretty much alone for a long time. But now, as we've heard some people say, every state has become a border state. Every city is a border city because what happens at the border does not stay at the border. You get migrants who ultimately make their ways to big cities like New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago. The mayor of New York says a few thousand migrants showing up in New York will destroy New York City. Well, what about the 7 million people that have come across the southern border and then released into the interior of the United States? Released at the Texas-Mexico border. Not a lot of empathy, not a lot of sympathy for what we've had to endure, our border communities and the people of Texas, not to mention the billions of dollars that we've had to spend of taxpayer money by Texans to do the federal government's job. It's outrageous. And the part that is most tragic is, of course, all the lives lost to the drugs that come across the southern border. What the Biden administration does not seem to understand, or if they seem to be in willful suspense of their power of disbelief, is that the 71,000 Americans who died of fentanyl overdoses last year, those drugs come from synthetic opioids made from precursors, come from China, go to Mexico, made into something that looks like a pharmaceutical product, relatively innocuous, but fentanyl poisoning is the leading cause of death of Americans 18 to 45 years of age. You know, I keep asking myself, what's it going to take? What's it going to take for the Biden administration to wake up and do something about it, to do its job? Well, obviously, 7 million migrants, that's not enough. 108,000 dead Americans, apparently that doesn't get President Biden's attention. How about the 300,000 children, the unaccompanied minors that have been placed with sponsors in the interior of the United States? The New York Times documented that in 85,000 cases, when a call was made 30 days after the child was placed with a sponsor, there was no answer. There have been some terrible stories about forced labor and very dangerous jobs, but it doesn't take imagination to realize that what the Biden administration has done is lose basically 300,000 children. We don't know whether they're going to school. We don't know whether they're getting the health care they need. We don't know whether they're being trafficked for sex, forced into involuntary servitude. We don't know, and the only conclusion I can reach is the Biden administration and the President of the United States does not care. He doesn't care. Because if he did care, he would do something about it. Well, because we have been met with complete intransigence by the Biden administration and by the majority here in the Senate when it comes to solving some of these problems on a bipartisan basis, there are many of us who'd be willing to work on a bill. We've worked on bills. I see the senator from South Carolina who bears the scars of having worked in the immigration issue many years, as have I. This is a tough, hard issue. But enough is enough. And we're not going to proceed to this emergency supplemental that the President has asked for unless and until policy changes are made to our asylum policy, the catch and release policies that will stem the flow of millions of migrants across the border only to be released into the United States. It will not happen. I'm confident of that. So I won't go through the statistics. Let me just mention one example. You know, it makes no sense for migrants who come from places like Haiti to move to South America to avoid what are admittedly dire circumstances in Haiti, only to live in South America and then when the opportunity presents itself to show up in Del Rio, Texas and claim asylum. They have escaped the circumstances which caused them to leave Haiti and living in a safe third country. So why is it that under the current policies, we say, okay, if you make it to the U.S. border, we'll let you in if you claim asylum? Well, you're claiming a credible fear of persecution based on what happened to you in Haiti, not what happened to you in South America. Yet this is a huge flashing green light and a welcome mat for people anywhere around the world who want to make their way to our southern border. Eagle Pass Mayor Rolando Salinas has said that the city of Eagle Pass has lost at least $500,000 during a closure of a bridge due to the influx of migrants. You know, one of the things we did during President Trump's tenure in office, which I think was one of the most significant, was we passed the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement in recognition of the fact our economies in North America are intertwined and that millions of Americans' jobs depend on that flow of legitimate trade and commerce across our international bridges. But again, one of the other consequences of President Biden's border crisis is that even the benefits of that trade and legitimate commerce are being denied because resources at our bridges and ports of entry are being overwhelmed. I mentioned New York City. Last year, more than 130,000 migrants have arrived in New York City. That city spent $2 billion to manage the crisis. That's a drop in the bucket compared to what the state of Texas has had to do over recent years. But it's no surprise that the mayor and others in New York have taken notice. I think that's the point. Governor Abbott knew that if the Biden administration was going to ignore the plight of border states like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California, that maybe he would care if these migrants showed up in New York City. Now, a poll has shown that New Yorkers are overwhelmingly concerned about the influx of migrants in their state and in their city. 82% said it was a serious problem. So why doesn't President Biden, who maybe doesn't care about a red state like Texas, but he should care about a blue state? The truth is he should care about the entire United States, but let's just maybe question why he would ignore the pleas of Mayor Adams and the voters in New York State, a state that probably was responsible for his margin of victory in the last presidential election. Well, he continues to ignore it, and in fact, the Senate Majority Leader from New York, where Mayor Adams is mayor of the major capital city there, despite the fact that Senator Schumer represents that same state, he's criticized the Republican effort to actually address the Biden border crisis. He's called it partisan and hard right. Well, frankly, that's all the majority leader and our Democratic colleagues have been willing to do. But we're not going to miss this opportunity to get true policy changes which help stem the flow of illegal migration across the border. It's clear that the President and Secretary Mayorkas, who's been an absolute unmitigated disaster as Secretary of Homeland Security, I told him at the last hearing we had, I have lost confidence, any confidence in your willingness to do your job. You should resign. Well, he continues to show up and testify under oath and to lie when he says the border's secure. Well, anybody with eyes in their head can tell that that's not true. And he's told the Border Patrol, don't actually tell anybody what's happening at the border. Well, enough is enough. We're not going anywhere on this supplemental appropriation bill until and unless acceptable provisions are made to change the policies that currently implement the Biden border crisis and to staunch the flow of drugs and people across the border. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from South Carolina.
Thank you. I just want to pick up where Senator Cornyn sort of left off. He's been a great person to try to work with to find a solution to our immigration problems, but what we're dealing with on the Senate floor is not an immigration issue. To my Democratic colleagues, I've worked with many of you on solutions to immigration. comprehensive immigration reform, we are now having to deal with a broken border from a national security lens. 172 encounters that we know of people on the terrorist watch list, and FY21 it was 15, so it's going through the roof. So we got to get control of our border for our own national security's sake. Terrorism's on the rise, the world is on fire. Now's not the time to have a broken border. And the numbers are really astounding. In September, we had the highest encounters at the border in recorded history. In December of 2020, we had the lowest in decades. And FY23, which ended September the 30th, 2.5 million people. Since President Biden's been in office, 6 million people. That's larger than the state of South Carolina. So one of two things are going on regarding the border. The Biden administration wants it to be this way for some reason, or they're incompetent. If they're incompetent, they need to listen to people who've actually tried to secure the border successfully and work with us to get it done. If they want it to be this way, it's going to end if you want money for other countries. I have been involved in about every gang there is on immigration reform, but I'm here to tell my Democratic colleagues, I'm not going back to South Carolina and say, I provided money for Ukraine and Israel, which I desperately support, unless we fix in a real way the problems at our border. That's unsustainable for me. Speaker of the House was just addressing the Republican Senate. I think he understands the need for Ukraine funding, but he says border security has to be real for the House Republicans to be able to do what they need to do. To my Democratic colleagues, you're fighting us in a way that makes no sense to me. I understand why we should send money to Ukraine. You had me at LO. I understand why we need to help our friends in Israel. I don't understand why you fight the changes that would bring back order out of chaos. Is that the position of the Democratic Party, that the policies that led to this overwhelming surge of illegal immigration are not subject to change? We're not going to vote for legislation that doesn't stop what's on this chart, period. Look at the line. FY20, 458,000 encounters. FY23, 2.5 million. It's got to stop. Look at the asylum systems being completely gamed. It's become a joke. It needs to stop. Parole. We've had some major efforts to reform asylum. Senator Langford's doing a good job. To my good friend, Senator Bennett, I want money for Ukraine. I support Ukraine funding. I think a lot of Republicans do, but we got to have real reform on the border. And your statement that Ukrainian aid should be separate and apart from border is not going to happen. So parole is meant to be a case-by-case analysis based on two things. There was an urgent humanitarian reason for the person to come in under parole, or significant public benefit, any alien applying for admission to the United States. That's the law. It's being abused. Past administrations granted parole in a handful of cases. There had to be an urgent humanitarian reason, or the individual in question had to provide a significant public benefit. The Biden administration is using the parole statute to allow people in by the hundreds of thousands without any individual analysis, in my view. So all I'm asking you to do is follow the law. Quit using the parole statute to allow hundreds of thousands of people in violation of the law. If we went back to what the law says, most of this would stop. Secretary Mayorkas, here's what he said to Senator Lankford. We need the ability to remove individuals who do not qualify for asylum with efficiency and speed. Why are so many people coming? Word is out that if you get into America, you ask for asylum, you never leave. We release you into the interior of the country. Years pass before your asylum claim is heard, and you're here in America and you never leave. We have to change the asylum laws so that you actually have to apply the first safe third country you pass through, not just here in America. And we should not release you until your claim has at least been adjudicated at the initial stages. 90% of asylum claims are eventually denied, so clearly the screening system needs to change. So, long story short, we're not going to pass a supplemental that doesn't have policy changes to dramatically stem the flow at the border. This is not an immigration negotiation. There's not going to be a DREAM Act provision attached to this. This is about locking the border down in a fashion to give the public confidence that as a nation we have the ability to secure our own border. To all my friends on the other side and on this side who have negotiated immigration reform in the past, President Biden's irresponsible handling of the U.S.-Mexican border has made it virtually impossible to do an immigration deal anytime soon. No Republican in their right mind would vote for a comprehensive immigration bill until the Democratic Party can prove that they're capable of securing the border. Everything we've worked for all these years has been lost. Your approach to the border during the last 3 years has made it impossible to do immigration reform until we first secure the border, not as part of an overall effort to deal with immigration, but you need to prove to us and the people of the United States you can and will secure our border. Until you do that, no deal. How this ends, I don't know. I just know this. I'm okay with aid to Ukraine. I'm more than okay with aid to Israel. I am insisting on border security that's meaningful. I'm not asking for H.R. 2. I'm not asking for everything I would do to secure the border if I were king of the country. But I've been around this issue enough to know what works and what doesn't. The policy changes we're insisting upon regarding asylum and parole need to be implemented to regain control of our border, and that's not too much to ask. Madam President, I look forward to working with our colleagues on the other side and you to find a way to help Israel, who are in dire straits, find a way to keep Putin from going past Ukraine, bring some sanity back to the world, but you're going to have to work with us. And we're not looking for half measures. We're smart enough on our side to know what works. And I'm not into doing a deal that doesn't work. With that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate the words of my colleague from South Carolina. I fully support everything he said, and I want to come up and speak again to the challenge that we have at the border and why we need to take action now and why that action needs to be taken as part of a supplemental that includes funding for Israel and Ukraine. The situation at the border has simply gotten out of control. But I think it bears repeating. It's been said by some of the folks who spoke before. We're talking about a fourfold increase. Donald Trump was president for 4 years. President Biden's been president for 3 years. And in 3 years, we have nearly 4 times the crossings that we did in the Trump administration. Now, let's say some of that's because we had Title 42 and COVID. That's fine. We can argue that. But we can still recognize this is a 2 or 3 time increase in illegal crossings. Now, we've lost operational control of the border.
we don't have situational awareness at the border. Let me explain what that means. When you have 1.5 million people that we know came into this country illegally, they paid money to a cartel, $5,000 to $50,000, depending upon what country they came from, to get into this country illegally, but some of them specifically want to go through a sector that the cartels specialize in making sure that you never have to encounter a border agent. They're called gotaways. Over the last 3 years, 1.5 million gotaways have entered this country. Now, I've been to the border several times. It is not, once you cross the Rio Grande River, most people are going to go present themselves to a Border Patrol agent. And then you're going to be processed. You're either going to get screened for asylum or you're going to get paroled. But from the time you cross the border to the time you're released into the United States, it's a matter of days or a week. So why would somebody spend money? Why would 1.5 million people spend money to expressly avoid being detained? Unless they've got a bad record, unless they have criminal intent or malign intent. Ladies and gentlemen, we have captured or apprehended people at the border who are on the terrorist watch list. Now, so we've lost operational control of the border by a fourfold increase in crossings. We've lost situational awareness because we don't know where these 1.5 million people are. We only know that they set foot on American soil, and it's highly unlikely that they went back. Now, I hate to almost draw this parallel, but I think it's important. One of the things when Israel is able to be successful in their response to Hamas, Israel's going to have to go back and say, how did this even happen on October the 7th? Well, we know, and I think a part of that analysis is going to be that they had lost situational awareness on the threat coming from Gaza. Now, people may say it's an unfair comparison. I don't think it is. When we have almost 8 million people by the end of this administration here illegally, is it fair to say that a few of them hate America, that they could be terrorists? They are on the terrorist watch list. There is a compelling homeland security reason for securing the border. And the American people agree. I want to get quickly to the negotiations that are being led by James Langford. The American people now, a majority, we're not talking a plurality, we're talking about a majority of Americans' people, Democrats, Independents, Republicans agree that we have a major problem or a crisis at the border. Biden needs to fix this problem. Biden needs to fix this problem for senators that are running up. This is not a situation where it's just Republicans saying we want a secure border. We always do, we always will. This is now the American people in the electorate saying that we need to fix it. So when we get into negotiations, of course we've got to change asylum policy, and of course we've got to change parole policy, and of course that's going to make some Democrats get out of their comfort zone. The last thing I'll leave you with, in the last Congress, ladies and gentlemen, I participated in every single bipartisan bill that was passed out of the Congress in the last Congress. I took a lot of heat from the right for doing that, and I did it for good reason. Now, the Democrats can say that they had a bipartisan vote in the last Congress, but they didn't. All 50 of them voted for something that I worked hard, or 51, voted for something that I worked hard to get 11 or 12 or 15 Republicans to vote on. So now it's time for Democrats to demonstrate their commitment to bipartisanship. It's time to let some of their members get out of their comfort zone or vote no on the supplemental, while the other ones who recognize this is a problem and that the American people have disapproved of this administration's handling of it, now it's their time to be bipartisan. Now it's their time to recognize that parole reform and asylum reform is critical to reducing the future flows. And I hope that my colleagues will, because as someone who's tried to be bipartisan and respectful to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I have no intention of supporting a supplemental bill that doesn't have meaningful bipartisan border security that we can measure on an almost immediate basis in terms of reducing the future flows. So, Madam President, I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that I thoroughly enjoyed working with on bipartisan efforts in the last Congress will see that this is an opportunity, this is their time to demonstrate the same courage to get out of their comfort zone and do what's right for the American people. I yield the floor.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to speak for 5 minutes, and also that Senator Menendez be allowed to speak for 5 minutes as well.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President, and I want to echo the comments of both the esteemed senator from South Carolina as well as the senator from North Carolina, and I rise to address the same subject, and that is to bring attention to the crisis that's taking place at our southern border. And, you know, the cause of the crisis is very clear, and the numbers do not lie. In fiscal year 2022, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, encountered nearly 2.4 million illegal crossings at the southern border. In fiscal year 2023, the number of encounters rose to nearly 2.5 million. 2.5 million. Now, since the start of fiscal 24, just the first month, there have been over 240,000 illegal crossings at our southern border. Put differently, this means that after just over a month into the fiscal year, this fiscal year 2024, nearly 250,000 people have tried to illegally enter the United States via the southern border. And these are just the individuals that we know about. Reporting shows that since the start of fiscal 2024, there have been more than 23,000 known gotaways. Since the beginning of the Biden administration, there have been 1.7 million gotaways. Additionally, CBP has confirmed that a dozen individuals on the terrorist watch list have attempted to illegally enter the United States through the southern border already this fiscal year in just 1 month. And look what's going on in the world right now. And we have people on the terrorist watch list trying to cross our border. The American people can see the problem even if the Biden administration can't, or worse, just continues to choose to ignore it. This crisis is the result of the Biden administration's failure to secure our border, pure and simple. It's not an issue of not having comprehensive immigration reform. It's a failure of the administration to enforce the law. The open border policies of the Biden administration jeopardize our national security because border security is national security. I want to repeat that, and I'll repeat it again. Border security is national security, and Americans know it. The situation at the southern border has turned every state into a border state. Last month, I was in Jamestown, North Dakota, to stand with the 817th Engineer Company of the North Dakota National Guard as they prepare to deploy for a year-long mission to assist CBP in securing our southern border. So now we've got the National Guard down there trying to secure the border. But again, they can't get the job done if they aren't given the enforcement authority to do it. DHS writ large, as well as any other support down there, has to be given the authority to enforce the law, and the administration will not do it because the administration wants an open border policy. As we continue to debate the upcoming supplemental appropriations package, we must include real, enforceable steps to secure our border. This should include benchmarks so we know the administration is enforcing the law and reducing the number of encounters and illegal entries. The administration's current policies prioritize processing migrants who illegally come across the southern border and then providing them with housing, transportation, and other services once they enter the United States. The administration is turning CBP into one of the most well-funded government-run travel agencies in the world. Any supplemental funding must secure our border, our own border. That means ensuring that the administration reinstates the migrant protection protocols or the Remain in Mexico policy, enforces third safe country agreements, and resumes construction of the border wall. Those things are all in place now. It doesn't require legislation from Congress. Those are measures that are in law now. The administration refuses to enforce them because the administration wants an open border policy. And we need to include benchmarks that hold the administration's feet to the fire and ensure that these policies get enforced. The Biden administration must address the border crisis enforced the laws that kept monthly encounters to lower numbers under the prior administration. We're not guessing about this. We saw that it works under the prior administration. And take border security seriously, because again, border security is national security. With that, Madam President, I yield.